Hello everyone! Today I'm here to share with you some of my adult fiction favorites. I've been getting into the adult genre a lot over these past couple years. I really would say that 70% of my reading, especially last year, has been mostly adult books. So I have come to learn which books are my favorite in the adult genre, which ones I would recommend, and that is what this video is all about. So I am going to be giving you 2 or 3 recommendations within each genre of like adult books, because there's always genres within subgenres. There's always just a big umbrella and you have smaller umbrellas that go with it, if that makes any sense. So some of the genres I'm going to be recommending to you are like romance, historical, sci-fi, fantasy, thrillers, just a lot of different genres that I've read. There are some that I haven't read, so if you're looking for some horror recommendations, I don't have them for you because I don't read horror a lot, but for the most part I try to read a lot of different subgenres within the adult fiction community. Obviously I'm not 100% versed in the whole adult fiction community, but I'm working my way there. There are some genres that I'm very new in, as you can tell with this video, and there are some that I've read a lot in, but these are just my personal favorites from each of these subgenres, and maybe they will help you in case you want to get into the adult fiction genre, or maybe if you love it and you're just looking for a new recommendation. Either way, I hope these help. First up, let's talk about historical fiction, which if you would have told me a year ago I would be semi-interested in this genre, I would have laughed in your face, because I really don't love historical fiction, but I've learned to love it. I'm slowly growing my way into it, but one of my favorite books of all time is historical fiction, and that is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. This is my favorite book that I read in 2018. Just a phenomenal book from start to finish. It'll make you sob, it'll make you feel things, it will burrow its way into your heart forever. It'll find a little section of your heart and just live there. This follows 2 sisters during World War II. This follows them as they are living in France, and they both lead very different lives. One of the sisters is a mother and her husband is called to war, so she has to raise her daughter all alone in a town that is being slowly infested by Germans. And then we follow the other sister, who is younger and wants to do the right thing and wants to help fight in this war. She decides to help a lot of American and British air pilots try to find their way after they've crashed, and it's just their story of how they survived World War II and the things they had to do for themselves and for their family in order to survive. It is it's an intense book, I'm not gonna lie to you. It's gonna make you cry. It's gonna make you feel things. It's gonna do a lot. But at the root of it, it is a beautiful message about family, about love, about war and grief, and all of the things you have to go through. And it's a beautifully told book. And I'd say if you are not a fan of historical fiction, I would recommend this. I think anybody will love this. Like, I recommend this to anybody. Regardless of what genre you read, I think you will fall in love with this book. Next up, we have one that's kind of historical, kind of mythology. I don't know, I thought I would just put it in the historical fiction category, and that is Circe by Madeline Miller. This obviously follows Circe, who was a witch, and she was banished to this island, and then she meets Odysseus, and it just follows Circe throughout her life of how she got to that island, how she met Odysseus, and her life story pretty much. I really enjoyed it. It's a very beautifully told book. I will say the first half is very slow, just be forewarned, at least in my opinion, but the second half really picks up. I'd say if you're a very character-driven reader, this is a great book to read, because it really follows the entire life of Circe. You get to figure out what she did and things like that. So I really enjoyed it. I'd recommend it if you like historical fiction, and if you like mythology, this is definitely a great book to read. My last 2 historical books, they are kind of historical. I don't really think of them as historical, honestly. Like, when I look at them, I don't think of historical. Sure, they were set in the past, but they just feel like so not set in the past. I don't know how to say it, but they're kind of contemporary with a mixture of historical fiction. The first one is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. This follows a famous actress, Evelyn Hugo, who rose to stardom in the 1950s. It's about her journey of how she rose to fame, and also in particular her 7 husbands that she had. Evelyn Hugo was a really big deal. She was, think of like Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor kind of big deal. Like, back in the day, she was the bomb. Everybody knew who Evelyn Hugo was. I always recommend this book because it is so beautifully told. It's historical because it is told like in the 50s and 60s, but it also gets flashback, but we also are set in the current day. So you get flashbacks into the 50s and 60s. So technically it's historical, but honestly, I think it reads like a contemporary book, but I love this book. Highly recommended. I'm sure you've heard about it because everyone gushes about it with good reason. And another book by the same author that just got released is Daisy Jones and the Six. This book is set in the 70s, and it follows a band called the Six and how they rose to fame as well, and also how they added the Daisy Jones into their mix. And this book is told in all interview format. Think of like VH1 Behind the Music. This literally reminds me of an episode from that show. So it's told in all interview format. You get to hear from every single member of the Six, as well as producers, as well as like Rolling Stone people, just everybody that has a commentary on the Six of how they really rose to stardom and then they just broke up all of a sudden. Nobody knows why. And then this book hashes out the details. If you like Fleetwood Mac, you would love this book. If you just love 70s music, rock and roll scene, music vibes, you would love this book. It's historical. I would say this one is more historical in my opinion than this one because this is all told in the 60s and 70s and you really get a vibe of the whole decade from this book. So those are my historical recommendations. I recommend all of them. If you could read all of them, go for it because I think they're all phenomenal books. Moving into a genre that I know a lot about is romance. I read a lot of adult romance books. I really enjoy the genre, honestly. It is one of my guilty pleasures. I could read a ton of them. Also want to say that I have a romance genre in here and I have a women's fiction because I kind of classify them as different things. I know that sounds weird, but that's just how I am. So I am cheating. So I can recommend a whole bunch of books to you. Hope that's okay. For romance, I have 3 books. The first one being The Hating Game by Sally Thorne. This is probably my favorite adult romance of all time. I adored. If you love hate to lovers trope, read this book. You will love it, guaranteed. This is about Lucy and Josh who are working for the same company. They're like they're assistants to co-CEOs and there's this job opening and they both want it and they have to compete for it. And then you can guess it, a romance happens and it is beautiful and steamy and all the things for hate to lovers trope. Another one I love is The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. This one is a fake dating trope. So if you're into that, highly recommend this one. This follows Stella, who has Asperger's, which is on the autism spectrum in case you didn't know, and she doesn't know how to navigate love life. She decides to hire this guy named Michael, who is a male escort, and he starts to teach her things and they form a relationship. And again, with adult romances, you can guess what happens from there. So much steamy times in this book, so much romance, highly recommend it. And my last romantic recommendation is Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating by Christina Lauren. I really enjoy Christina Lauren's books. They are just fun to read, honestly. This follows Josh and Hazel, who went to college together and knew each other but weren't really friends. Now years later they've reconnected and have decided to set each other up on dates, and every time they do that the date ends up in a disaster and Josh and Hazel kind of end up getting closer together. Again, you can guess what happens. So if you are a fan of romance, I would highly recommend these. Moving into a genre I still don't know a lot about. I'm still really slowly dipping my way into the waters of this genre, so please forgive me on that regard. Martian by Andy Weir. This is one that got made into a movie a few years ago. I really enjoyed the book and I really enjoyed the adaptation. I thought both were winners. This is a book that follows Mark Watney, who is an astronaut, and basically him and his team are up on Mars doing some astronaut things. I'm really bad at sci-fi terminology, and a big storm kind of happens on Mars and Mark Watney gets left out because he gets stuck and they can't find him, so they kind of presume him as dead. Only Mark Watney is not dead and he is alone on Mars now because his crew has left Mars and they're orbiting back to Earth, and then they hear that he is alive. So basically Mark Watney has to survive on Mars alone until a shuttle can come pick him up, which, let's just, you know, it's Mars, so it can't just be like, hey, I'll fly by in like 20 minutes and pick you up. No, it's going to be like years because they have to structure it and it has to be like the right orbit and a lot of astronaut scientific terms I quite can't understand. But either way, Mark Watney is the amazing part of this book. His voice is just so dry and witty and just funny, honestly. Like, his commentary just makes the book honest. I heard the audiobook is amazing. I physically read it, but if you want to check on audio, great. Overall, I loved it. Thought it was a great sci-fi, probably my favorite adult sci-fi of all time. Other recommendation for you for sci-fi is Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. I read this a few years ago, and this is a mind, put in your word right there, of a book. Like, when I think of books that really just mess up your mind, Dark Matter is one of them. The plot is just so about a man who is a professor at a college, and then he's got a wife and a kid, and then somehow he meets another version of himself, or he gets locked. I forget the actual plot. It's been so long. Basically what happens in this book is that he learns that there is a whole bunch of parallel universes, and there's a whole bunch of versions of him out there with different lives, and he is trying to figure out his way back home, or what is really home. Was his home really his home? Is it all just a thing of the mind? It is. It's a crazy book. It's gonna mess with your mind. It would make a great movie, I'll say that. But it's a book that I will never forget. Like, I know I forgot some details of it, but when I think of like books that just really blew my mind. It just really made me confused a lot. I think of Dark Matter, and I would recommend it. It was a good time. It was a good book. Moving on to literary fiction. So for me, it took me a long time to figure out what exactly is literary fiction. Literary fiction just means that it's kind of set in modern day times, and it doesn't really have a genre. It just focuses on like a group of people or community, whereas, you know, romance is more particularly about two people falling in love or just a romantic plot, so that's why it's romance. Sci-fi, you have a sci-fi element into it. Fantasy, you know, there's all these genres. Literary fiction is just kind of about, I'd say, a character and a character's dissection and things like that, that's set in modern day times. At least I think that is. I could be 1000% wrong. I don't know. I'm sure you'll tell me. But to me, that is what it means. So I have two books for literary fiction. One of my favorites is Beartown by Frederick Bachman. I always rave about this book because it is a book that is a very intense read, but it's a very beautiful read. This follows this town that is called Beartown. It's a very desolate town, and Beartown is really known for their ice hockey. That is really all they have going for it. They have a high school team and they have an older team. And basically, you're somebody if you're on the ice hockey team. Everybody covets the ice hockey team. They look up to the boys. The boys are treated like these amazing people because they're on the hockey team. There is a sexual assault that happens during the course of this book involving one of the members of the Beartown's ice hockey team, and it splits the town into two. Some people believe what happened, some people don't, and it just really kind of divides them. And it's all about that. It's all about how this one act has really changed the trajectory of this town. It's a beautiful book. It's very in-depth. You follow a slew of characters from high school kids to adults, people that are affected by this. It also talks about so many amazing things such as sexual assault, such as depression, a lot of different important topics. I think Frederick Bachman handled it beautifully. I would highly recommend this book. I can't get enough of it. I will always talk about it. And the other literary fiction book I want to recommend to you is Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. More on the much lighter scale of things, Eleanor is a warm hug. To me, Beartown's book is probably going to punch you in the gut because it's very intense. Eleanor Oliphant is just like an embrace of a warm hug. It's just heartwarming. It's about Eleanor, who struggles a lot with social situations. She has a very strict schedule of doing things on a certain time. She goes to work, she comes home. That's all she really knows. And she has a very strained relationship with her mother. And then she kind of helps save this older man she meets on the street, and she saves him with her coworker. And then her whole life kind of changes. She starts to meet new friends. She starts to have kind of a life outside of what she knows. Slowly, Eleanor just kind of blossoms into a new person. It is a beautifully told book. I love it so much. I would highly recommend it. So in case you like want to do a duo where you want something that's going to punch you in the face and then one that's going to embrace you after that punch in the face, I would recommend both of these. Moving into a genre that I don't know much about again, but I am making a lot of headway with it, is adult fantasy. So I'm actually reading a whole bunch of adult fantasy right now, so I'm trying to really dive into the genre as a whole. So I really only have 2 books to recommend to you because I'm still reading a lot of them. Hopefully I'll have more to recommend to you later. The first one being Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This is an amazing adult fantasy book. I love it. It's one of my favorites of all time. This follows college students Eli and Victor, who are both they're both having to like make a final paper on their senior year, and basically the character Eli discovers EOs, these extraordinaries that have powers after they have died and come back to life. So he decides to make his whole paper and whole like project to become an EO. So Victor gets in on it, and they decide to do experiments of like dying and then being resurrected to see if they will become an EO. Spoiler warning, it happens for both of them. And after that, they become like mortal enemies for a certain reason. And this book is told in a lot of different timelines. You start from now and then you get to learn about what happened to them. And it's basically a book, I would say like kind of Marvel, X-Men-y, but both about really morally gray characters. If you love a good villain story, would highly recommend it. The series is called Villains. This does have a sequel called Vengeful, but I personally did not love it as much. So honestly, I would read this as a standalone. Like, if I'm being 100% honest with you, I would just say read Vicious and be done with it because I didn't love Vengeful as much. But overall, I love this book. If you love a book about good versus evil, about evil versus evil, would highly recommend this one. The other adult fantasy book is one that I just actually finished, and that is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. I'm sure you've heard about this book because a lot of people on BookTube, when they talk about adult fantasy, they talk about the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. I can see why. It is a phenomenal book. It is a slow burning book in my opinion. I didn't really fall in love with it until around the 250 page mark, but after I did, I was very much invested in this book. This book, oh, it's so hard to explain. Basically, a long time ago, a hero tried to rise and save the world. He failed. Now we have this evil, like, emperor lord guy ruling over. He's been ruling over a long time. Nobody knows, like, flowers, ash just falls from the ground. It's dark, like, all the time. Mist comes out. Just a really desolate place because the evil guy has won. Now we have a character named Kelsier who has decided that he's going to rebel against it, and he's going to get an army. He's going to get people, and he takes this girl Vin under her wing because they are both Mistborns. They both have powers. They're both oh gosh, I can't pronounce that right. Alchromancers. They both can control with metals and things like that. They can ingest metals and they can use it for various reasons. I'll do a whole video on this book, but they're going to fight back. They're going to take back the Empire once and for all. They're going to take it from the evil Lord Ruler, and it's going to be amazing. It's definitely a ride of a book, that is for sure. This is the first book in a trilogy. I just finished this one, so I need to read the second two, but I would recommend this one. I'd say if you're just getting into adult fantasy, highly recommend starting out with this one. It's slow and steady, and then it picks up around the end and it just explodes. I loved it. Moving into adult mystery slash thriller, I have read a few of these. The first one being You by Carolyn Kepnes. If you've heard about this, it was just made into a TV show. It exploded as a TV show. I read it first and then I watched the show. Would recommend both of them, honestly. This follows a main character named Joe who is a stalker. He works at a bookstore and he meets this girl named Beck and he becomes obsessed with her. He discovers where she lives, who he's friends with. He just really stalks her entire life, and he tries to fit his way into her life as her boyfriend, and it just really follows him. And this book is told from Joe's perspective, so you get inside the mind of a stalker, and it is an insane book. I highly recommend the audiobook if you're going to read this book because it's told from Joe and you really get a sense of who he is and just how creepy he is. I loved it. I would highly recommend listening to the book then watching the show. Really enjoyed it. The other thriller that I really enjoy is Final Girls by Riley Sager. This takes on the trope of the final girl at the end of a horror movie. There's always one girl left standing. This kind of follows that trope. A main character named Quincy who 10 years ago survived this really big murderous thing that happened in a cabin in the woods, which sounds like a horror movie because it kind of was. And she is living her life now after this brutal murder that she survived, and she's part of like this finals girls club where there's a whole bunch of these girls that have had the same kind of thing happen to them and they survived and lived to tell the tale. And then one day one of those girls ends up dead, and so now everyone's thinking, are there somebody after the final girls, and what is Quincy going to do about it? And it follows from there. I really enjoyed this book. It was one of my first thrillers that I read and I loved it. I thought the plot twist was very twist-worthy in my opinion. I didn't see it coming. I highly recommend it. A great thriller of a time, honestly. My last genre I want to talk about is chick lit slash women's fiction. So what differentiates, at least for me, this is my 100% honest opinion, what's different to me about chick lit and romance is heavily the plot, where I think chick lit is more about the character or just a funnier time, if I'm honest with you. I don't know, maybe that's just me. I think of those books I recommended about earlier as strictly romance books, and these two books I'm going to recommend to you, I really think about the character, honestly. I don't know if you would agree, disagree. Either way, here they are. Number one, I've Got Your Number by Sophie Kinsella. My favorite chick lit of all time. I love this book. Would highly recommend it in audiobooks. Any Sophie Kinsella book. Audiobooks are the way to go. They're just funny, humorful. This is about a main character named Poppy who is engaged, and she loses her engagement ring, and then somehow she's indebted to this guy named Sam, and they start conversing over the phone of like he has to owe her one, and then all this other kind of things. It's just a hilarious book, I think. It does have romance in it. Yes, it's one of the main plot lines, but I just thought it was hilarious and would classify it more as chick lit. The other one being Maybe Another Life by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This one follows Hannah, who moves back home to LA after living in New York and not having a great time, and then the night she moves back home, she goes out to a bar with her friends, runs into her ex-boyfriend who she's kind of in love with, and at the end of the night he's like, hey, do you want to come home with me? And therein really starts the plot, because the plot changes a lot after that. So in alternating chapters, we follow her life if she would have gone home with her ex-boyfriend, or we follow her life if she would have gone home without him. So it's like one life over the other one. You're going to be rooting for a life, not necessarily romance, but more of a life. So that's why I kind of classify it more as like a women's fiction chick lit book. I don't know. I loved it. Was obsessed with it. Those were some of my favorite adult fiction books. I hope you enjoyed my recommendations, and I hope you got something from it. If you didn't, I apologize. Like I said, I'm reading new new adult fiction every single month. I'm trying to get myself more immersed into it. Hence this month I'm reading like only adult fantasy books. So I'm trying. Slowly but steady wins the race. And if you want to see any particular recommendations as far as like adult romance or adult literary fiction or sci-fi, thrillers, things like that, please let me know. I'd be more than happy to do so. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye.